Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. I'm your host, Steve BERG. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Lytical Ventures. Lytical Ventures focuses on early-stage investments of companies that drive corporate intelligence. Corporate intelligence includes, for example, cybersecurity, data and analytics, and artificial intelligence. You can find us at www.lyticalventures.com. Lytical is spelled Lytical, Ventures, all one word, .com. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. We have a new production partner this season, VC Careers. If you're looking for a job in venture capital, join over 8,000 VCs and VC job hunters on John Gannon's VC Jobs email list. Visit johngannonblog.com/intangibles to learn more and to subscribe. Also, please find Intangibles on its new home on the web, www.intangiblespodcast, all one word, .com. When the eyes say one thing and the tongue another, a practiced man relies on the language of the first. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that. I'm not sure if he ever played Texas Hold'em, but I bet my last dollar there's not a poker player out there who would disagree with him. Every day we interact with people and we have to decide how completely we believe what they are communicating. We listen and we watch for little inconsistencies to give us clues as to their level of sincerity. This helps us make decisions and propel ourselves forward in the world. Who better to talk to about body language and tells than a former professional poker player? My guest today is Zach Elwood, and he fits the bill perfectly. He's a former professional poker player and the author of 2 books on poker tells. His first book, Reading Poker Tells, is widely regarded as the best book on the subject and has been translated into 3 languages. In addition, he's worked as a poker behavior consultant for 2 World Series of Poker main event final tablists. For the novices, the main event is probably the most well-known poker game in the world, and the final table is made up of the last 9 players after thousands have been eliminated. Last year, the winner of the main event walked away with over $8 million, so it's kind of a big deal. Zach, welcome to Intangibles Podcast. I appreciate you taking the time from the many things that you're currently doing to speak with me today.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Before we get into tells and body language, I'm going to indulge myself a little bit. Could I trouble you to tell a story or an anecdote from your career? I mean, I expect every poker player has a number of great stories. Is there some insanity or bad beat or poker cultural microcosm that you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, sure. It's funny when you ask a poker player to think of things they remember. The first thing that pops in most people's heads, I think, is horrible bad beats. But then those are usually pretty boring because they're the most memorable thing. But I'd say something more entertaining than that would be in 2013. I think it was. I played in a few World Series of Poker events, the smaller ones, not the biggest ones. I played in a $1,500 event. And I don't play many tournaments. It's I'm mostly a cash game player. So when I got and I made the decision when I got knocked out of the tournament, I would give out my book to whoever knocked me out. It was kind of an idea I got from Barry Greenstein. He used to do that with his book when he got knocked out of tournaments. So the way the hand went down, the guy, my opponent, made a very good read that I was bluffing, and he called with a pretty weak hand on the river or on the turn. He called with a pretty weak hand. And when I gave him my book, when I got knocked out, there was some smart ass at the table that was like, I don't think he needs that. And everybody laughed. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's touche. That's a good point. And then I walked away in defeat. So I thought that was a fun.
Poor guy. You're just trying to do the guy a favor.
Yeah. Then I was like, maybe I won't maybe I won't give it out if I get if my bluffs get picked off. That obviously in the future. So that's kind of fun.
Yeah. Maybe you should give it out to the person that you knock out as a result of not reading your hand.
That's better. Less opportunity for humiliation there.
Okay. All right. Tells. So I think most people know what a tell is, but let's assume that they don't. Can you explain just quickly what a tell actually is?
Sure. My own definition of a tell would be it's an observed behavior that is correlated with a certain trait. And that's a general definition. In poker, you would say it's an observed behavior during a poker hand that is correlated with a certain hand strength. And so I like to say observed in this definition because I think there can be all sorts of unobserved, unnoticed information that is present, that we never pick up on. But I don't think that information becomes a tell until someone notices it and has the potential to act on it. So it's kind of a semantic distinction, but that's just how I like to phrase it.
No, that makes perfect sense, right? You're eyeing somebody to give you information, and they're essentially willingly parting with that information. Mm-hmm. But I guess my question is, what's the reason that a tell actually happens? I mean, why aren't people good at keeping secrets, or why aren't they better at telling lies?
Yeah, I'd say mainly it's an experience level thing. And sometimes I'd say it's also just a lack of caring from someone who is not paying attention or doesn't care about the stakes or whatever. But mainly it's experience. I'd say it's the more you play poker and the more you learn about behavior and how that can show up, the more you understand the common ways that information can leak. But when you're fairly inexperienced, just starting out or, fairly recreational, you don't know all those ways. You're just not aware of them. You may think you do, but you don't. It's kind of like poker strategy. Poker strategy is just so super complex. No limit hold'em is more difficult to solve than chess from a game theory, optimal perspective. There's just so many options and branches in the game tree in no limit hold'em. But a lot of amateur players, people who are just starting out, think that it's a simple game. You can get that idea of just when you just start learning poker that it's very simple. So it has a lot of hidden complexity, and it's the same thing with poker tells and behavior. I think a lot of people read my books and say, "Oh my God, I had no idea I was doing that just then, but now I know that I'm doing it all the time, and that's been a huge help." So it's just awareness, which is mainly a factor of experience.
So what you're saying is that once you're cognizant of the fact that you have a tell, you can actively stop from communicating that tell, right?
Yeah, for the most part. I do think there are some cases where even being cognizant of it doesn't mean you're going to be cognizant of it in that moment. You might know it intellectually, but in the heat of the battle or whatever, that stuff can leave your mind. For example, like I still catch myself doing, acting more loosely when I'm betting a strong hand versus when I'm bluffing, and I'll look back after the hand's over. I'm like, I probably wouldn't have done that specific thing if I were bluffing here, So it's just kind of, everybody has blind spots no matter how much experience you have. Little things can leak. Whether anybody sees them or not is another story, because I think most of these things go unobserved. But the point is, yeah, you can still have some blind spots.
Interesting. So everybody has them. That's what you're saying. No matter how good you are, you could still have it.
You can, but I think the more, the main point is the more experienced you are, the better you are at understanding these things, the less you're going to have them and the more unreadable you're going to be. I think, it's pretty rare to get a reliable read from a guy who's a very experienced, very good live player. It can happen. There's definitely cases, I've got examples of that where I think somebody's got a reliable read in this case, but it's just, few and far between for the better you get.
Right. So, I think the point is all around self-awareness, right? Because you can limit it once you become aware of what you're doing, how you're acting, how you're reacting. Once you're in control of that, then your tells are going to be limited.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's just no substitute for experience. Like in most things, it's hard to have shortcuts. I do think, not to toot my own horn too much, but I do think my books and videos help you get to that level quicker, but it still requires a lot of experience to, be comfortable with the information and know how to use it in different contexts.
Yeah. This might be a stupid question, but are tells and body language the same thing?
Yeah, that's another semantic discussion there. I think they're similar. To me, body language means, someone's body movements or posture is conveying some sort of meaning. And I think tell, it's similar, but I think it's more of a connotation of a single thing that really gives a lot of information. And I don't really use tell in that way, in the sense of, it's giving you a very specific set of, this means this. To me, tells are more ambiguous. They just make something a bit more likely than the opposite thing. Or, I mean, they can be very meaningful, but they can also be, only slightly meaningful. And also, I'd say the distinction there too, a tell can be verbal too, so not just body language.
Right.
So yeah, little differences in meaning there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. In particular, have you always been a naturally observant person? And the reason I'm asking is because I'm trying to figure out if that's a prerequisite for being able to spot, behavioral patterns or body language or tells.
Yeah, I don't think of myself as naturally observant. If anything, I would say I'm often not observant. So in some sense, it was me feeling the need to try to quantify this stuff more exactly so that I could, wrap my head around it more. That was part of my interest, was to make it a more formal study of it. Because I'm often kind of overwhelmed by information and find it hard to parse a lot of stuff when a lot of things are going on. So I don't think you have to be naturally observant, but because I think you can formalize it into a more conscious kind of set of rules and things to think about. But I definitely think it helps to start out, naturally observant. And I definitely think some people are naturally observant, and they have one leg up on, studying these things. My other thing is I've always been interested in psychology and behavior. I used to read all these psychology books that my dad had laying around the house, and that was how I got into kind of behavior and psychology early on, which was probably was related to me reading the books and everything later.
So to me, that's really good news, right? Because if I don't have to have some kind of innate gift, that means that chances are I can learn something, or I can get better at this.
Right.
In your mind, what's the best way to get good, or at least marginally better, at spotting kind of behavioral patterns or tells?
Well, I'm obviously kind of biased, but I'd say to read my books and maybe get my videos. There's other people have such products too. But I think in general, it's just acquainting yourself as much as possible with what's possible for tells or information to leak, and trying to understand those things. And the more you understand those things, the more you'll start seeing them, and the more you'll be able to eliminate them from yourself. And actually, I've had quite a few people tell me after reading my books, especially the Verbal Poker Tells book, they would say, this had application outside of poker, just because it starts getting you thinking about these kind of, very subtle, minute things that you otherwise might not try to find meaning in. And for getting better at this stuff, I would also recommend Paul Ekman's books. He's a guy, if you don't know him, he has a lot of books about his research in body language and facial expressions. He's got a few books. And then there's also a book called I Know You Are Lying by Mark McClish, who was a former U.S. Marshal, and he based on his work, crime investigation work. And it's about verbal and written language analysis. And it's actually was the inspiration for me writing Verbal Poker Tells, because I saw, I was just inspired by how much meaning he was able to get out of people's, letters they had written or phone messages they left or whatever, just all these making these correlations, which I thought were very, very accurate and very reliable.
Yeah. So my takeaway is, first of all, you got to know that the game is going on, right? That there's people actually giving you information. And then second of all, it sounds like practice.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's kind of generic sounding, because that's probably how most things work. But yeah, I think that's basically what it boils down to.
No, in my mind, that's good, right? I want something that if I'm determined to do it, that I can get better at it.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I'd say, a lot of people act like I, think I'm the genius of poker tells, and it's not that at all. I'm just a guy who thought I could produce better content about poker tells than what I saw that was out there. Because when I was playing for a living, I was like, the books that are out there, I know a significant amount more than the stuff I'm seeing out there. So, and as I was writing the books and making the videos and stuff, I learned more myself. So I really saw it come true, because it started out with me just being like, I can write a better, book than this Mike Cara's Poker Tales book, which was written like 30 years ago, and that was my goal. And but then as I researched and thought about it, I learned more and more. So I think that's true of everyone. Everyone can go through that process and learn more and more.
One thing that I picked up about this is that whether you have a tell or multiple tells, they probably don't exhibit themselves very frequently. It's not something that like every hand you're going to be like, haha, he's got the 4 and 5 of diamonds. It doesn't. You got to be vigilant, and it's going to happen from time to time to give you a slight edge.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, for sure. And I don't know if we've stressed that so far, but yeah, that's a very important point that I make early on in all my content. That tells are just a small part of playing poker. Some people have kind of an exaggerated romantic idea of how important tells are. They've watched movies or just have it. It's in the cultural sense that tells are super important. But in reality, it's, if you're playing in a typical 8-hour poker session, you might base a decision on a physical read maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times during that session. It's not going to be frequent, and it's going to depend on the quality of the kind of people you're playing against and all that. There's going to be a lot of factors. You might not encounter any that you feel are reliable, or you might encounter a lot depending on the players. And overall, I like to say it adds anywhere from 10 to 15% to your win rate overall. So it's, it's good to keep these things in context, even though it can be a big help. It shouldn't be something where, you're always trying to get reads all the time, because that's just going to, you should let it come more naturally to you and not try to force it. It's, if you have the knowledge and feel comfortable about the read, then you'll know it.
But dude, 10 to 15% is huge. I mean, think about this. The difference between a journeyman in baseball who bats, say, 250 and a Hall of Famer is 300, the batting average of 300. That's 5 extra hits in 100.
Right.
If that's 5%, and you're talking about 10 to 15% performance improvement, that's enormous.
Well, think about it like this, though. In baseball, they're playing very, very skilled competition. In poker, you're usually playing recreational players who are not nearly, assuming you're a professional poker player or that level, you're playing players that are much worse than you. So I think that's where it becomes, the analogy is different, because in sports, you're playing against the best.
Right. So there's more gap to take advantage of. Okay.
There's a bigger gap. Yeah. So it's not as unrealistic as it sounds. Yeah.
But I'll still rather,
because all it takes is one big pot from that you win from a tell, from some very amateur player, and that's a big increase to that session or to your win rate in general.
I'll take that. I'll take that extra 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
Let's define, I'm taking a half step back here. Let's define baseline behavior. First of all, I think we need to just explain what it is, and then, how much time it takes to gather a baseline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's a hard science or anything like that. And I will say, for some tells and behaviors, there are tells that you can feel confident about making a cold read for, for someone you've never played with before. Sometimes some of the tells are just so reliable, even in a cold read setting. So you don't always need a baseline, but the baseline definitely helps for the more ambiguous and varying kind of tells, the ones that, you want to get a player specific read for. And, as far as studying a baseline, I mean, I think, it comes down to judgment, because there's definitely some people that would feel comfortable making a read based on just a few minutes of playing with someone versus hours. But it all depends on your comfort level. I mean, I like for some of the tells, I'd want to play with someone for several hours to see, the specific behavior and see how it shows up over quite a few hands.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, definitely, when you're not sure, it's definitely best to watch someone for a while. And one of the biggest things to watch is like when they make, you know, the biggest, most important category of tells is when people make bets, because that's where you get a lot of information. Like they're making a big bet on the river, the last round of betting. You might, you start to see more like polarization of like relaxation versus anxiety in those spots because there's more on the line. So
Right.
those are the most important spots to watch
Yeah.
for trying to get baselines and things like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you didn't write about this, but I was thinking about it in terms of statistics, right? You're looking for a mean behavior, and then you're looking for a behavior that deviates from the mean. And so,
Mm-hmm.
however long it takes you to define what that mean behavior is, that's how long it takes to have a baseline.
Yeah, that's a good scientific way to describe it. Basically, you might play with a guy who is always, saying, some weird thing in every hand he's in. So obviously, that's not going to mean anything when he does it later when you're in a hand with him. It's just that's the basics of it. Just getting a sense of what's normal and what's unusual for a player.
I guess what I'm encouraged about is that there is a such thing as cold reads. I would have guessed no, but what you're saying is, yeah, you could. Some things are obvious if you're practiced. So there's goodness in that. What I guess, I'm thinking back to my particular field, which is making deals. And, sometimes I sit down at a table and just the initial kind of sizing a person up to go, all right, this person's a rookie. There's a lot to be gained in negotiation with this person, or this person is totally a professional fibber. Like this is what they do. They know how to cut deals. And I know it's slightly different here, and I'm tangentially overlapping. But any thoughts about how you come to a quick decision on, all right, I've got some fish in front of me, or no, I've got a shark here.
Yeah, it's a tough one to say exactly. I think there's a lot of factors, and they can be quite varied. Yeah, but this is something that I don't know if you know Mike Caro's work, but he wrote the first book on Poker Tales back in like the late '70s, I think, and he talked about getting reads on beginner level players and getting reads on experienced
Right.
players. And some of the stuff was like how they stack their chips. It was like, an amateur might stack them in weird, disorganized ways. That's one clue. You can see how they handle their money. Like, do they pull it out kind of trepidatiously, or do they seem anxious about how much they should buy in with? Whereas a professional or an experienced player is just going to know how much they're doing, and has a lot of hundreds or whatever. Do they, what's their demeanor like? Do they seem anxious or do they seem very relaxed? But, all these things, there's a lot of factors behind even all those, because you can have very relaxed amateur players who've played a lot, but still may be very bad. And you can have very skilled online players who haven't played much live. So they're, kind of nervous for that way or seem uncertain for that reason. So there's a lot of factors. I mean, I definitely think some of the cold reads do, when you are able to make a cold read, it's because you've correctly analyzed, you've correctly decided that player is either, usually amateur, a more amateur player, because more of the common basic tells will apply to them. So I think that's one factor in making those cold reads. Sort of like you said, spotting someone who you think is kind of green to negotiating and maybe feeling more comfortable that you can get more meaningful information out of them,
Right. I think that explanation raises a pretty interesting point. And that is that a tell in particular doesn't actually need to be super reliable to be actionable, does it?
Right. It does not have to be. Yeah. And that's one thing I try to stress in my books too is, a tell is not just, this means that 100% of the time. Tells can range in, confidence level from, it can just be like slightly reliable. Like, it's going to mean a strong hand, let's say 55% of the time, as opposed to, so it's just making it slightly more likely. And those are still actionable. They're obviously not as clearly actionable because it's pretty seldom you're in those spots where that small amount of reliability will help you. But where it does help you is in spots where you're really on the fence between two decisions, like there's lots of spots that come up where you pretty much feel it's even money whether to call or fold a big bet on the last round on the river. So you're thinking, well, it's basically long term here. It's 50-50 whether I should call or fold. But if you get a little bit of information, even if that behavioral information might just be slightly reliable, that'll put you over the top and say, okay, I'm going to call or fold based on that,
Yeah. Any information is better than no information.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people, I think that's what leads to people, getting frustrated with tells and any kind of soft kind of often ambiguous study or subject matter. People can get frustrated because, it's not, I want things to be more clear cut, but as long as you accept that, if the idea is for you to be making more right decisions over time than wrong decisions, you're going to make wrong decisions, right? You're going to make those wrong decisions, but it's about, trying to find all the information you can and trying to analyze it as best you can. And then being okay with the variance of saying, I'm going to act on this tell because I think it's slightly reliable. It may, I'm going to be wrong a good number of the times, but I think I will be right more often than I'm wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the nature of venture capital, actually. Okay. So as this podcast strives to take things that are intangible and make them more tangible, what I did is I extrapolated a couple behaviors out of the situational poker hands from your latest book. Not the one in the intro, but the latest book. Mm-hmm. What I want to do is try and dig in on them and see what we can learn from them. First one, you mentioned something called the phone call read. So instead of like a whole bunch of explanation, just a quick and dirty explanation of what it is, so that we can really kind of talk mostly about what we can infer from people's behavior about prioritizing activities. That phone call read was a prioritizing activities
right.
thing, I think. So just a quick, explain the situation.
Yeah, basically, and this doesn't come up too often, but it was a fun one where a guy who's, a more recreational player, he often would step away to get his phone for business calls during the game, and he would just muck his hand or whatever. But so in this case, he stayed. His phone was ringing the whole time when he was just waiting in late position pre-flop, waiting for action to get to him. And he just let his phone ring. So I knew right then, like, he must have a big hand because otherwise he'd be walking off the table to get the phone call. And sure enough, I think he had aces. I can't remember what it was. Aces or kings, I'm sure.
Yes.
But yeah, that was just a case of, a funny little clue, like, because we knew that he had those priorities when he decided to pay attention in this spot. We knew his priorities had shifted.
Yeah. Just keep your eye on what the person thinks is most important. I think that's huge. Okay. Next one was something that you call leaks of interest. Same thing. Just a quick explanation.
Yeah. I think this was this similar to the last one? If you know offhand what that.
Yeah. So in this particular one, the guy would, kind of pick his hands up with his cards like he was about to muck even before it was his turn to muck.
Oh, right. Yeah. There's a lot of interest and lack of interest kind of tells that are in these spots, like especially when it's your turn to act and you see somebody behind you kind of giving away what they're going to do before it's their turn, and so, a good example of that would be, on the river in the last round of betting, it's a multi-way pot and somebody goes to bet early and then you see a guy in last position, already getting his cards to muck, to throw them away. It's just good to keep an eye on what people are doing, out away from the action. It's kind of like they don't think the attention is on them that much, and they may not even be, invested in what is going on even more because they kind of mentally checked out of the proceedings. So it's good to keep an eye on what's happening away from the action. I think is the moral there. You can also see this, in different contexts too, because there'll be sometimes when somebody acts very interested in a hand, but it actually means, they're just trying to act defensively and and put together chips before action gets to them, which they wouldn't be doing if they were actually strong, you know. So it's those kinds of getting clues from how they're acting when they think the spotlight's not on them.
Yeah, and I think what I took away from it also is that people are more likely to tell you the truth when they're more relaxed, right? And so this was a situation where he knew it wasn't, or she knew that they weren't going to be in the hand, didn't really care, and gave you the information. So and then you realized before betting, I'm only betting against one player, not two players, and so I can assess my risk return on that easier.
Right. When you get a sense that people aren't going to be really involved in the situation, yeah, then it becomes more like, okay, yeah, now I have less people to worry about.
Yeah.
Now it's like I only have one opponent or something.
Yeah. The notion of having information ahead of the actual action, the kind of like preview of it is probably immensely helpful. Okay. Ostentatious betting motions. This is the same thing. And this one I think is about what we interpret from people who create a whole sense of a false sense of urgency.
Right. Yeah. And this is kind of related to what we were just talking about. A good example of this is if, pre-flop before the board cards that come out, you've got somebody in late position, who it's not their turn to act yet, but they're like putting together chips as if they're ready to raise, and they're putting a chip protector on their cards as if they're ready to play. That person's hardly ever going to have a strong hand, right? Because if they had a strong hand, they like to remain inconspicuous. So that can help you rule out that person's really strong. They might have a medium strong hand or something that they are interested in playing, but it rules out the, top of their range basically. And I think this does have, this has applications in real life because, it's when somebody actually has a position of power, they don't usually, try to scare you out of doing something. When if a person thinks they're going to win or thinks they have the upper hand in a situation, they're not usually trying to discourage you from, doing something that would where they would have the upper hand,
where they would gain benefit.
Yeah. So sometimes these kind of like I call them obstacles to action. It's kind of like when you see people doing that, it can make you more confident that they're, not as strong as they like you to believe, or yeah.
Okay. This one that I'm about to kind of set up is one that I thought was really interesting. There was a situation in which you actually folded the hand, but then you went back and you analyzed it, and it clearly you learned a lot about it. And this one in particular was headed defensive behavior. I'm wondering, like, I'll get to what I think I learned. Let's just set it up for a second first. What was the situation? Do you recall?
Yeah, so I'd raised, this was a limit game, by the way, so not no limit. So it was in limit 2040, and I raised an early position with pocket deuces, and then I got a couple callers, and then on the flop, which was 9-8-4, so I didn't connect, pretty ugly flop for me. There was a regular player, a player I frequently played with. He was he was third to act after me. And then as I got ready to bet, he was grabbing his chips and just acting defensively. Like when people grab their chips before it's their turn to act and act like they're ready to call, especially in limit, it's a sign that they're defensive and not really, happy. They don't have a strong hand, basically, because, if they really had a strong hand, they'd act more inconspicuously and they'd act more thoughtful. They'd just be more focused in general. So, and this player specifically often acted in these agitated ways. It was a common thing for him, so I knew it was kind of a player specific tell. So I bet another player, second player folded, and the third player, the defensive player, called, and then on the turn, the next card was a 9, another 9, putting 2 diamonds out, so there's potential flush draw. So here, when I bet, he raised me, and I couldn't figure out what he had, and it was very unlike him to act really aggressive in these kinds of spots. So I ended up folding. But then he showed me, a hand that made complete sense. He had ace king of diamonds, which he had a strong hand pre-flop, weak on the flop, but then on the turn he, he turned the flush draw, which made him confident enough to raise and do a little bluff there, which I had a weak hand, obviously, but I think with all the pieces afterwards, the fact that he was defensive on the flop and then willing to raise on the turn, I should have put the pieces together that was one of the few hands he could have had.
Yeah. So to me, this is really good, right? Whenever you spot a behavior that seems inconsistent, you don't just necessarily throw that away as inconsistent. You say, well, wait a minute, there's got to be a situation where that behavior actually makes sense. What is that situation? And if you can kind of deduce that situation, you can play kind of stronger and more accurately. Same thing for deals, I think, too. If you can, why would this counterparty act as they're acting? Because normally they're giving you the behavior that's in their best interest.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I thought was particularly something that you could take away, and you didn't actually touch on this in setting it up for us, but whenever you're in doubt, so you folded that hand, but one of the things to do is to slow things down and buy a little bit of time to figure out how this particular peg fits into this particular hole.
Right. No, I think that's very important, and I reference that in other parts of the book. It's like, I often the hands I look back on with the most regret or kind of anger were hands where I rushed the decision, and if I had just thought about it a few more seconds, I could have put a few more pieces together and made the right decision. So yeah, I definitely think it's kind of, I think that's the kind of maddening thing about I would think poker and any sort of negotiation or analysis work. It's like you always know the more thought you put into it, you'll probably eventually reach a better decision. But obviously, there's time-based factors, So, but I think it's always good to even just once you have a decision, just think about it a few more seconds, and maybe some more maybe a better decision will come to you.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so we're going to lightning round the last couple of these things, and then we're in the home stretch. All right, so joking statements. When people make a joke, what seems kind of odd at the time, does that always mean insecurity?
I think it's some of my books I categorize tells as mainly being, there's either the waiting for action or early hand tells, and I separate those from kind of big bet tells, like tells from players making big bets. So I think the one you're talking about was joking statements from players who, when it's still early in a hand or they're not the person betting. I think in those situations, those are often going to be defensive, because usually if they have a strong hand, they're going to be focused on the situation more. They're going to be thinking about the best way to play it. They're going to be not wanting to draw attention to themselves because they don't want to scare away action. There's just a few reasons why you won't often hear joking statements or much verbal behavior at all from players with strong hands early in a hand. So it all depends on these things often depend on when in the hand it is and what the situation exactly is. Whereas if this was from a player making a big bet, I would say that was more likely to be strength, just because it's a different kind of situation.
Okay. Fake gulp. Is this nervous behavior or is it a fake out?
Yeah, this is I can see how this could apply to a lot of real life situations, because we all know the nervous gulp, kind of thing, which, we all generally agree comes up from nervous people. But I think, in poker, it can be a little bit more complex, because in a lot of these spots, it's like for a big bet, there can be a player that feels nervous or anxious making a big bet with a strong hand just because of the situation is exciting or whatever. And so it's a little bit more ambiguous. And you also got good players who know that it's a common tell, so they can, purposely do it. And that's what I purposely do. I actually, when I'm in a big bet situation, when I make a big bet, I know that I sometimes do have an anxious gulp. So I'll try to balance that by gulping and when I have strong hands too. So it's a conscious, calibration, or, to try to balance out my imbalance.
You're hiding your tell.
Yeah, trying to hide my tell by being balanced across the board in different hands. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's, I wonder if you have any stories about fake gulps yourself, noticing someone's nervous, or does that ever come up?
In terms of sitting across the table, I think there's Mostly at the level when there's 6 or 7 figures changing hands. Most of these guys are fairly seasoned, but I will tell you that I'm constantly searching for an edge. So watching for that stuff makes a lot of sense. And the truth of the matter is, there's nobody usually trying to fake me out, like consciously trying to fake me out, but they are trying to obfuscate their strength.
Yeah, I wouldn't think there'd be many, so-called fake tells in that setting. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of eye contact. Does it mean self-confidence?
This is an interesting one. Yeah, traditionally, when Mike Caro wrote about tells and 30 years ago, and the traditional sense of eye contact when betting has been that it's a bluffer, more likely to be a bluffer. And I actually said the opposite in my book, that I think most of these instances of somebody looking at you shows that they're very relaxed and have a strong hand. And I think it's because most players are not looking to have intense stare battles when they're bluffing. Bluffing is an uncomfortable thing for most recreational players, and when they bluff, they just want to be invisible. They don't want to make eye contact. They don't want to be observed. They're afraid you might figure out something from their eyes. So in my opinion, the more common behavior is avoiding eye contact when they're weak, and making more eye contact when they're strong. And especially for this stuff, you might find this interesting for real world things. I definitely think the back and forth kind of loose eye movement is the most meaningful behavior of all, because it shows so much physical looseness. Somebody who's willing to look back and forth from place to place it's a very reliable indicator of relaxation just in general, apart from the poker table, versus somebody who's just staring at one spot for a long time is likely to be more anxious. And that just goes along with physical looseness in general. If you got some dynamic, very physically loose guy come into the room, he's, you can tell he's more relaxed with himself versus somebody who moves more stiffly and more restrained. And I think the eyes are really are a good example of that in a small, in a smaller sense.
It's interesting. I would have thought that means that you're a person is more aggressively searching for information. And when a person is more aggressively searching for information, I would say that I would have guessed that typically meant they're weak.
Oh, I see. Yeah. This is the spot. This is something where there's two different categories we're talking about, because I was talking about somebody making a bet, and it sounds like you're talking about somebody who's waiting, who hasn't acted yet and is maybe looking at someone for information. And yeah, I agree with you there. That's what I would call waiting for action kind of eye contact, where somebody's kind of either defensively looking at a player to try to prevent them from doing something, or they're studying them for information. So yeah, I think when you think about those two categories, the two types of eye contact, are kind of opposite in a way, as it is for a lot of tells, because the situation is so different. You basically got one person that's on the offense, the person making the bet, and then you've got the other person who's more defense, non-aggressor.
Okay, conciliatory behavior. Is that a sign that someone's trying to put one over on you?
Yeah, and again, this is for this one, what we'll be talking about, somebody who's made a big bet.
Okay.
And so conciliatory behavior, it often shows up from a bluffer, because think about the opposite thing first. Somebody who makes a bet and then insults you, or is aggressive towards you and is rude to you. That is almost always going to be somebody who's relaxed, because a bluffer doesn't usually want to accidentally trigger you, anger you into calling him. So the opposite is this conciliatory behavior. You say something kind of mean to somebody who just made a bet, and he's just whatever you want to do, it's your choice. I'm just trying to play. Just if he's just real or friendly or conciliatory, it can be a sign that they're weak and that they're bluffing, because they don't want to accidentally anger you. It's not that super clear cut a tell is the opposite being rude behavior, but it's something to take into account with a guy, especially with how it usually comes up as somebody who's like usually like really aggressive and aggressive towards you in other spots. And then you get in one hand with him and he's like being really conciliatory. That can be a sign that he's, bluffing that hand.
Mm-hmm. So as we've been talking, I've been trying to like come to some kind of universal truth here. And the only one that I've been able to come to so far is that strong behavior typically means a weak hand.
Yeah, this is actually something that Mike Caro talked about in his book. His famous thing was weak means strong and strong means weak, which is a good, it's a good general interpretation of how these things show up. And I think, I actually think it's more for bettors, especially. It's a little bit more complex because I think a lot of strong behavior can actually be strong hands, because bettors, people with strong hands, do a lot of weird things. So it can lead to them being, kind of cocky and boastful about their hand, or just trying to have fun. So it's a little bit more complex for strong behavior, I think. But yeah, in general, though, this, strong means weak and weak means strong is a well-known way to sum up all of these ideas. Yeah.
No universal truth. That's disheartening. All right, Zach. So this is the home stretch, and regular listeners know that I always finish up with three things. The first is there anything about tells or body language that I didn't bring into the conversation that you would like to talk about that you think is important?
I would say, we had talked a little bit about application to real world and negotiation or those kinds of settings. I think, I think my Poker Tells stuff or any Poker Tells content, I think, even if it's not directly applicable to these kind of real world settings, I think the thing they do help with is just getting you to think more about the potential meaning in these small, subtle behaviors and verbal statements. So I think even if they don't have direct application, I think they do get you thinking in that mindset and maybe start opening your mind up to like, what are the small things in my realm of, work that I could start trying to study. I remember one guy wrote me recently, he's a doctor, and he said, he works with young kids, and some of them are like developmentally disabled or autistic. And he said that, learning about the nonverbal, the way people act nonverbally from my book, the physical things they do and to show anxiety and things like that. He said it helped him a lot with his practice. So I do think these things, even though they might not seem like it at first, I think they do often have connotations or applications to the outside real world, so to speak.
Well, certainly I would agree with that. So besides your books on the topic, I think you've mentioned a couple other materials, any materials that we didn't mention or resources that you would point people to about this topic?
I'd say, aside from my books, I do have my video series, which I think a lot of people have liked if you're more of a visual learner. Some people like to watch the videos on their phone when they play if they're bored. And that's at readingpokertells.video. Other than that, I have, in my books and videos too, I also give recommendations for other resources. Other than the ones I gave in here, I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Okay. And finally, where can people find you or follow you if they want to hire you or siphon off your genius?
Let's see. Twitter, I'm on Twitter at @apokerplayer. That's my handle there. I've got an email address. You can just go to my website, readingpokertells.com, and send me a message on the contact form. That's pretty much it. And I always get back to people if anybody wants to email about questions or talk about anything, really.
Fantastic. Zach, that's it. Thank you very much. You've been very gracious with your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I want to check out your other episodes when I get a chance soon.
Nice. You even got a plug-in for Intangibles. Genius. All right. That's where we're going to end. Thanks. This has been Intangibles. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, The Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd like to thank VC Careers for their support, and I'd also like to thank Ben Glawe, who's a fantastic sound engineer. It is a privilege to work with him. Find him on Twitter. His handle is @visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve Berg.